Hi guys, and welcome to Calling the Shots. Dylan's not here today, so today it's just me. And today we're going to be recapping the whole March Madness tournament. And as we all know, that the winner, who was North Carolina, beat Gonzaga earlier this week. So that was real good for them, and North Carolina finally able to get that win and be able to redeem themselves from last year. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with Princeton and Notre Dame. And right now, Princeton, they basically played behind most of the game, by 1 or 5 points, but they hung in there. But unfortunately, they weren't able to get the W. And Notre Dame led by Colston with 18 points. He did real good. Next, we have UNCW versus Virginia. And UNCW actually jumped out to a good lead, but they weren't able to keep the lead, and Virginia was able to climb back up and take that. And Virginia, they ended up having 2 players in double digits. They actually scored 20 plus points, which was great. So they had a great game. So then we have Gonzaga and South Dakota State. Now, speaking of Gonzaga being the number 1, as of course we go another year with the number 1s being undefeated against a 16 seed. And also the 15 seeds were not able to beat a number 2 seed, which is in the past hasn't happened as much, but it did happen last year. So we were hoping for that to happen this year, but nothing happened. But there were some upsets though, like Middle Tennessee, who was supposed to be the Cinderella this year. Also Northwestern. Now that was supposed to be they were supposed to be a good storyline heading into the tournament, because they were making their first NCAA tournament appearance in school's history, which is great. And they ended up winning their first game against Vanderbilt, and they were ranked 8th. Also going on in the tournament, there were other games like Xavier and Maryland. Xavier ended up winning that game and basically cruising past Maryland with great shooting, making about 50% of their field goals they shot. So along with that, SMU. Now SMU, they were 6th seed, and they were projected to go as far as the Elite 8, but they were shocked by USC, who was a number 11. They ended up winning with like 5 seconds to go, and SMU wasn't able to close it out. So along with that, Baylor, who was also a great storyline, made it pretty far, and Baylor ended up beating New Mexico State 91-73, and they were led by Jonathan Motley. And Motley's been doing real good even throughout the regular season, so that was no surprise there. Now moving on to the second round, it was going to be Villanova and Wisconsin. Now that was supposed to be a great game, but guess what? Wisconsin pulled out the upset, and Villanova was the first number 1 to lose. So Wisconsin moved on to the Sweet 16. What a shocker. Then you have USC and Baylor. Baylor did great against USC, but USC, they hung in there. They held their ground, and Baylor was just able to squeeze by and make it to the Sweet 16. Also, South Carolina and Duke. Now, Duke was actually projected to go to the Final Four in some brackets, but South Carolina, they said, well, what about us? So South Carolina ended up pulling up a shocker and beating number 2 Duke. So Gonzaga and Northwestern. Now that game got intense. Gonzaga did great, and Northwestern, they hung in there for a little bit, but Gonzaga was able to pull away, but it wasn't over there yet, because Northwestern, they had some fight left in there, and they ended up not beating them, but coming close to beating Gonzaga. And Northwestern, the fans, they got intense. They came all the way down to like 3 points, and Northwestern, the fans got crazy. Even when the refs weren't calling anything for Northwestern, calling a bunch of fouls against them. Like I remember watching this game, and there's this kid that they were showing on TV that was crying, going crazy and everything. That's how intense it got, which was great. But Gonzaga ended up pulling off the win, and Northwestern ended up going home. But they did do great, considering it was their first NCAA tournament appearance. Along with that, Notre Dame and West Virginia. Now those two, that was basically an even matchup, but West Virginia, they have a great defense. And that's basically what ended up winning them that game, was playing great defense and causing turnovers like they always do in the regular season. Now Xavier and Florida State. Florida State was number 3, but Xavier was number 11. but Xavier basically thrashed Florida State 91-66. Now on the other side, Kansas and Michigan State. Now that game was kind of close for a while, and then Kansas was just able to pull away and basically make a 90-70 win. So that was great. So Oregon and Rhode Island. Now that game was close. Oregon ended up squeezing by 75-72. And even though Oregon was favored to win that game, Rhode Island gave them a tough challenge and gave them a run for their money. Also, Michigan and Louisville. Now, Louisville and Michigan, they were two very favorite teams to make it to an Elite Eight. But Michigan ended up shocking Louisville, who was the number 2 seed, 73-69. Along with that, Middle Tennessee and Butler. Now, again, Middle Tennessee was a Cinderella, and they were supposed to make it all the way to the Sweet 16, but Butler said, no, we should make it. So Butler ended up beating Middle Tennessee, and Middle Tennessee ended up going home early than anyone ever expected. Along with that, North Carolina and Butler. Now that was a good game. Butler did hold their ground, but they weren't able to keep up with North Carolina, shooting 92 points to Butler's 80. On the other side, we have Baylor and South Carolina. Now Baylor was favored to win this, and South Carolina was looking at this as a tough challenge, because Baylor had been winning their games by a lot, and South Carolina, they were number 7 seed to Baylor's number 3. So a little bit intimidating, but unfortunately for South Carolina, that didn't stop them from winning against Baylor. Baylor ended up having turnovers, and South Carolina took advantage of them, scoring points off of those, and ended up moving on to the Elite Eight. Now Gonzaga and West Virginia. West Virginia, again, great defense, but Gonzaga, better three-point shooting team, and that's what ended up winning them the game. Now here's another shocker. Remember Xavier, number 11? They ended up shocking number 2 Arizona in the Sweet 16, about 73-71. Close win, but they still got it, and that made them go on to the Elite Eight. So with Florida and South Carolina meeting the Elite Eight, it ended up being South Carolina taking the win and just edging Florida 77-70. So they ended up making their first Final Four appearance in school's history, which is great. And they're not the only one, their first appearance in school's history. Gonzaga ended up being Xavier, the Cinderella. Unfortunately, Xavier lost, but Gonzaga, with that win, made it to the Final Four, and that was their first Final Four in school's history, which is great. And Kansas and Oregon. Kansas was favored to make it to the championship game, but Oregon ended up winning that game and moved on to the Final Four. Now, North Carolina and Kentucky. North Carolina and Kentucky, that was a close game. North Carolina just winning that 75 to Kentucky 73. And North Carolina, the thing about that game is that they actually scored their final 2 points in just under 5 seconds, which was great. And with that, they were able to squeeze by Kentucky and take the win and go to the Final Four again. So with the Final Four in play, it was South Carolina versus Gonzaga and Oregon versus North Carolina. And right now, Gonzaga and North Carolina. Now that game was close. South Carolina did hold their ground and everything, but Gonzaga was the better team that day, and really they just played better. And on the other side, Oregon and North Carolina, they did great. Oregon was a great team and everything, and North Carolina, they did great. Both teams were shooting well. Great defense on the other side too. It was just back and forth, but at the end of the day, North Carolina was just able to hold off just enough to beat Oregon 77-76. So with the championship game that happened recently, Gonzaga and North Carolina, 2 #1 teams and 2 programs that were hoping to take home a win. So with that game, North Carolina and Gonzaga. Now North Carolina did do something that other teams weren't able to do, and that was to beat Gonzaga to the 3-point line. And Gonzaga wasn't able to make those 3-pointers. They were forced to drive it into the middle, but they couldn't. And Gonzaga, they did shoot some threes, but they just weren't able to get the good shots that they've always wanted and that they've always been looking for because of North Carolina. And they did great. Both teams did great, but at the end of the day, North Carolina took the win. Well guys, that concludes our episode, and that's how the tournament turned out to be. So we hope to see you guys next time.